Shigeru Yoshida suggested to the U.S. government that Japan could request the stationing of U.S. troops after the peace treaty. This led to major developments in the issue of peace for Japan. In response to this, the U.S. government entrusted the issue of peace with Japan to a certain person. That was John Foster Dulles. He participated in the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. He also helped found the United Nations after World War II. As such, he was a lawyer deeply involved in international diplomatic issues. He believed that the punitive peace imposed on Germany after World War I led to World War II. He also strongly believed that punitive peace treaties do not bring long-term peace and stability. This led him to believe that the United Nations collective security system was essential to maintaining international peace. Based on this belief, he took a proactive stance toward achieving peace with Japan. However, once he landed at Haneda Airport in Japan, he headed straight for the Korean Peninsula. This was because the Korean Peninsula at the time was in a very tense situation due to the intensifying conflict between North Korea and South Korea. During his inspection of the 38th parallel north, he came face to face with the seriousness of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. This made him keenly aware of the importance of making peace with Japan. Upon returning to Japan, he began to work energetically to bring about peace with Japan. This led to him meeting with Shigeru Yoshida. He had already been informed by the U.S. government that Shigeru Yoshida had proposed that Japan could request the stationing of U.S. troops after the peace treaty. Therefore, he believed that peace with Japan would be achieved without difficulty. However, Shigeru Yoshida met with him with the following in mind. Japan must win a peace treaty on more favorable terms. I believe that the presence of U.S. troops should not be explicitly stated in diplomatic negotiations. As a result, Shigeru Yoshida continued to take a roundabout and ambiguous stance. This was because there was a debate in Japan at the time that the permanent presence of foreign troops in Japan could infringe on Japan's sovereignty. Furthermore, the presence of U.S. military bases could have provoked the Soviet Union and increased tensions. The biggest point of contention was that it could go against the principles of Article 9 of the Constitution. Due to these problems, the Japanese government was unable to formulate a concrete plan for how to make peace. Therefore, they were unable to reach a clear conclusion. John Foster Dulles was perplexed by this response from the Japanese side. He initially thought that the issue of peace with Japan would be resolved smoothly, but he came to realize that this would not be easily achieved. Under these circumstances, an event occurred that would change the world situation. That was the outbreak of the Korean War. The North Korea army crossed the 38th parallel and began to advance south. And 3 days later, Seoul fell. The South Korean military's organization collapsed and it was driven southward. This war had a major impact on Japan, which is geographically close to the United States. First, as soon as GHQ in Tokyo was informed of the outbreak of war, they quickly evacuated American families and others stationed in Korea to Japan. In addition, the South Korean government requested assistance from the U.S. military, including ammunition. The U.S. government then issued the following order to the U.S. military stationed in Japan. Send all military supplies stockpiled in Japan except for those that are needed for the time being to South Korea. As a result, the U.S. military needed to transport troops and supplies on a large scale. In response to this situation, Shigeru Yoshida issued the following statement. Japan is currently not in a position to actively participate in UN actions. But it makes perfect sense to cooperate to the extent possible. In line with this statement, Japan has begun cooperating with the U.S. military in Japan. Japan helped transport U.S. troops and supplies to Korea through rail and sea transport. In this way, U.S. military units began to set out from Japan one after another. As a result, the only major U.S. forces remaining in Japan were the 7th Division, stationed in the Tohoku region in Hokkaido. Moreover, even the 7th Division was considered for deployment to the Korean Peninsula. This resulted in a serious military vacuum within Japan. Douglas MacArthur saw this situation and gave the following order to Shigeru Yoshida. There is concern about maintaining public order within Japan. We need a unit to guard Japan in place of the U.S. military deployed to the Korean Peninsula. Establish a peacekeeping force. Until then, the United States had consistently promoted the demilitarization of Japan. Therefore, this directive, which would lead to Japan's rearmament, came as a great shock to the Japanese government. However, Shigeru Yoshida agreed to the directive. This is because he thought this way based on the world situation at the time. It is unlikely that the Soviet Union would invade Japan prepared for war with the United States. What Japan should be wary of is indirect aggression by communist forces. That's why we need to strengthen our police forces. This led to the creation of the National Police Reserve. The National Police Reserve was established with 75,000 personnel. At the same time, the Japan Coast Guard was ordered to increase its personnel by 8,000. Shigeru Yoshida welcomed the establishment of the National Police Reserve. However, he was cautious about rebuilding a full-fledged military. At that time, the Japanese economy was finally beginning to recover. It was clear that if money was spent on military equipment, the lives of the people would once again become difficult. What was most important to Shigeru Yoshida was to ensure the livelihood of the people and to enrich Japan. He was thinking, focusing on rebuilding the military will lead to stagnation of economic recovery. As a result, the warlords could make a comeback. What Japan needs now is economic recovery. A weak domestic society makes it easier for communism to penetrate. Realizing a prosperous Japan also leads to security in a broader sense. Based on this idea, he minimized the rearmament demanded by the United States and focused on economic recovery. However, there is no doubt that the establishment of the National Police Reserve was the starting point for Japan's rearmament. The National Police Reserve's purpose was to maintain peace and order in Japan. It was also defined as an organization that would supplement the powers of the national and local police forces to the extent necessary to ensure the public welfare. When the National Police Reserve was first established, its mission was to ensure domestic security as an auxiliary force to the U.S. military. As a result, the soldiers were sent to a U.S. military barracks and trained by the U.S. military. In this way, Japan began to gradually increase its self-defense capabilities within the limits of its national power.